The widow whispered, "Please bury my child. What the mountain man did next will surprise you." Pine trees swayed gently, their whispers carried by the cold wind. Birds called to one another from hidden branches, their voices like tiny echoes of forgotten stories. But beneath the beauty, the land felt heavy. People from the nearby village rarely ventured this far. They said the valley was cursed, haunted by old magic and forgotten grief. In this lonely place, a man moved with quiet certainty. His name was Kalen, though few dared to speak it. He was called the Mountain Man by those who whispered of him in fear and awe. Broad-shouldered and tall, he walked with the steady steps of someone who had known both solitude and sorrow. His hair was dark and unkempt, streaked with silver like frost on stone. His eyes were sharp, yet distant, as if they carried 1,000 untold stories. He lived alone in a cabin hidden among the rocks, surviving on what the forest offered and avoiding the world of men. Kalen had long stopped caring for the judgment of others, but the valley, though empty and silent most days, held its own strange life. It was as though the mountains watched, the trees listened, and the earth remembered every secret buried within its soil. One morning, as Kalen traced the path along the cliffs, he heard a sound that made him pause. It was a voice trembling almost like the wind itself had learned to speak. He froze, eyes narrowing through the mist. The voice came again, this time a whisper carried across the stones. "Please help me," it said. Kalen's heart, which had grown accustomed to silence, skipped a beat. He followed the voice down a winding path, the fog curling around his legs. There, at the edge of a clearing, he saw her. She was draped in a long, black cloak, the hood pulled low over her face. Her hands were small, clutching something wrapped in cloth. Even from a distance, Kalen could feel her grief, sharp and raw like the bite of winter air. Her presence was fragile and commanding at once, like a candle trembling in a storm yet refusing to be extinguished. Kalen stopped a few feet away, silent as stone. He had seen many who wandered the mountains, seeking help or escape, but this woman, she carried a sorrow that seemed to reach into the very soul of the valley. I need your help," she whispered again. Her voice cracked. "Please bury my child." The word struck Kalen like a stone. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Your child?" he asked slowly, his voice low and steady, like a river moving through deep canyons. She nodded, lifting the bundle in her arms. Even in the mist, Kalen could see the outline of a tiny body, delicate and still. The grief radiating from her was so intense that the air seemed to thicken, pressing against Kalen's chest. Why come to me?" he asked. "I am no priest, no healer. I am nothing for the living or the dead." Her eyes, dark and wet, met his. There was desperation there, yes, but also a strange fire, a demand that cut through his usual calm. "Because you are the only one who can," she said. "I have asked others, the villagers. They fear the curse, but you do not fear." Kalen felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Fearless, yes, but not because he had no fear. He had learned to live with it. He had seen death, had touched the edge of despair. And he had always chosen the solitude of the mountains to keep it at bay. Yet something about her plea, it reached a part of him long buried. "Show me the place," he said finally. His voice sounded firmer than he felt. She nodded, relief washing over her features. She turned and began walking, her steps careful and hesitant, as if she feared the shadows themselves. Kalen followed, keeping a distance, his eyes scanning the fog and the trees. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. The wind carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine, mingled with something darker, almost metallic. After a time they came to a small clearing. Here, the ground was uneven, roots breaking through the soil like veins. A large stone, blackened by time and weather, jutted from the earth. It was a place that had once been revered, Kalen realized, a burial site long abandoned. The trees here seemed older, twisted, and solemn, as if mourning silently for the lives lost to the valley over the centuries. The widow knelt, setting the bundle on the ground. Her hands shook as she touched the soil. Here is where he must rest, she whispered. I cannot do it myself. Kalen approached slowly, studying her face. He saw the traces of nights spent crying in silence, the deep lines of grief etched into her skin. Her beauty was overshadowed by loss, yet it shone in a strange way, the light of someone who had loved deeply and wholly. Why was the child taken? He asked, though he feared the answer. She looked away, tears slipping down her cheeks. The sickness, the dark illness. It came from the village, from the king's lands. They tried to hide it, but he could not survive it. And I could do nothing. Kalen's fists clenched. He had always hated injustice. Yet in these mountains he had no power to change the world. Still, the rawness of her grief touched him in ways he could not deny. "Let me help," he said, kneeling beside her. "Tell me how I should." His words trailed off as the wind shifted. A low rumble echoed from the mountains, almost as if the valley itself was listening. The widow's eyes widened. She seemed to sense the same thing. "The ground, it moves sometimes," she murmured. "The curse, the valley remembers. Be careful, stranger." Kalen felt the weight of her words. The valley had always been strange, but now it seemed alive in a way he had never noticed. The mist swirled, curling like fingers brushing against their faces. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the roots and stones. It was as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Still, Kalen began to work. He dug into the earth with his hands, his muscles straining. The soil was cold and damp, smelling of moss and decay. The widow knelt beside him, whispering prayers in a language Kalen did not know. Her words were soft, like a lullaby, and they carried the weight of hope and sorrow intertwined. As they worked, Kalen felt a connection forming between them. He had always lived alone, thinking himself incapable of care or companionship. But now, kneeling beside this grieving woman, he realized he could feel more than solitude. He could feel responsibility, and perhaps even something like love. The air grew heavier as they continued, the mist thickening until the forest seemed almost unreal. The shadows danced in the corners of Kalen's vision, and then a soft sound. It was not the wind nor the rustle of leaves. It was a whisper, almost a sigh coming from the earth itself. Kalen froze, glancing at the widow. Her face was pale, eyes wide. "It is him," she whispered. "He remembers. The child, the sorrow, it calls him." Kalen's heart pounded. He had heard stories of the spirits that haunted these mountains, restless souls tied to grief, bound to the land by magic older than any king. He had never believed in them fully, yet now, with the bundle of the child before him and the widow trembling at his side, he could feel something ancient stirring. The ground beneath them shivered, small cracks forming along the roots and stones. Kalen tightened his grip on the earth, trying to steady the small grave. The whispering grew louder, a low murmur of longing and accusation. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, the mist curling around their hands and faces like a living thing. "Do not fear," Kalen said to the widow, though he could barely convince himself. "I will see this through." She looked at him, hope and despair mingling in her eyes. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me he will rest, that he will not suffer." Kalen nodded, though he knew that promises were fragile things in a world ruled by grief and old magic. Still, he felt the weight of it in his chest, heavier than any stone he had ever carried. As the sun began to rise, spilling weak gold across the mist, Kalen finished the grave. He laid the bundle of the child gently into the earth, covering it with soil, roots, and stones. The widow knelt beside him, her hands pressed to the ground, whispering farewells he could not understand. And then, the earth itself seemed to shudder one last time. A soft, almost musical sigh rose from the soil, carrying both sorrow and peace. The mist swirled around them, parting briefly to reveal the mountains above, their peaks glowing faintly in the early light. Kalen and the widow stood in silence, the valley holding its breath. Neither spoke, for words felt meaningless against the enormity of grief and the fragile hope they had unearthed together. Finally, the widow turned to Callan, tears streaking her face. "Thank you," she whispered. You did what I could not. You saved him." Callan's eyes met hers, and for the first time in many years he felt something stir in his chest that was neither fear nor solitude. It was connection, fragile and luminous, like the first light breaking through mist. But even as he stood there, watching the widow retreat down the mountain path, he could not shake the feeling that something had awakened. The valley was alive with secrets, old as the stones themselves. And somewhere beneath the earth, something stirred, watching, waiting, remembering. Callan turned to the grave once more, his hands resting on the cold stone. The mist wrapped around him like a shroud. The wind carried a soft whisper, almost a sigh, as if the mountains themselves spoke. "Watch closely, mountain man, for the story has only begun." The shadow of the valley stretched long and dark as the sun rose fully, and Callan knew that his life, and perhaps his heart, would never be the same. The morning after the burial, the valley felt different. The mist clung to the mountains more tightly, curling around trees and rocks as though the land itself had secrets to keep. Callan walked along the path leading back to his cabin, his steps heavier than usual. The memory of the child's small, still body pressed against him like a stone he could not set down. The widow had vanished into the mist before dawn, leaving only footprints and the echo of her grief. Yet Callan felt her presence lingering, as though she had not truly left. He sensed it in the hush of the trees, in the way the wind shifted through the rocks. The valley, once silent and solitary, now seemed to breathe around him. Callan reached his cabin and went inside, but the solitude he had once cherished now felt hollow. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, seeing not his own reflection but the child's face, peaceful yet touched by sorrow, as though even in death, the soul sought justice. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. Callan tensed, instincts honed by years in the mountains alert. Slowly he opened it to find the widow standing there, her cloak damp from the mist, her eyes wide with urgency. "Callan," she said, voice trembling, I need your help again. Please, you must listen." Callan stepped aside, allowing her to enter. He could see the exhaustion etched into her face, but also a fire, a determination that made the shadows in his cabin seem small. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. He did not trust himself to reveal the stirrings of worry in his chest. She knelt by the fire, warming her hands. "The child, he is not at rest. The burial was right, the soil sacred, but there is something, a shadow tied to him, something from the old magic of the valley." Callan frowned. He had heard whispers of spirits bound to grief, of magic that lingered in stone and soil, but he had never encountered it directly. Yet as he looked into her eyes, he felt the truth of her words. There was something beyond death that held this valley in its grip. "What do you mean by shadow?" Callan asked cautiously. The widow drew a deep breath. "Long ago, the king of the nearby lands dabbled in dark powers. He sought to bind people to his will even after death. My family suffered because of it. My child, he carries the echo of that curse. He is caught between worlds." Callan felt a chill crawl along his spine. He had spent his life among the mountains, avoiding the affairs of kings and men, but now he realized he could no longer remain apart. He had promised the widow, and promises were heavy, even more so when death itself was involved. "What must be done?" he asked. "You must go with me to the old ruins," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "There is a place where the curse began. If we can find it, perhaps we can free him." Callan hesitated. The ruins were dangerous, overgrown and avoided even by the bravest of villagers, yet he could not refuse. He had seen her grief, felt the weight of her sorrow, and somewhere deep inside he knew he could not turn away. "I will go," he said finally. They left the cabin together, moving through the thickening mist. As they walked, the widow told him stories of the past, of kings who had ruled with cruelty, of families broken by fear and dark magic. She spoke softly, as though speaking too loudly would wake something that had slept for centuries. Kalen listened, absorbing every word. Each tale made the valley feel heavier, more alive. The wind seemed to carry whispers, soft voices echoing from stone and root, warning them, guiding them, or perhaps merely observing. By midday, they reached the edge of the ruins. Stones jutted from the earth like jagged teeth, remnants of towers and walls that had once gleamed under the sun. Vines and moss crept over everything, softening the harshness of the stone but not the memory it carried. Kalen's heart pounded. The air here was different, charged with a tension he could feel in his bones. The widow led him to a small stone altar, cracked and worn but still standing defiantly against time. "This is where it began," she said. Her fingers traced the carved symbols on the stone. "The king performed rituals here, trying to claim the lives of those he feared. My family, my child, they were caught in it." Kalen bent over the altar, studying the markings. They seemed to pulse faintly in the mist, glowing with a light that was neither warmth nor cold. He could feel the presence of something ancient, watching, waiting. Suddenly, a sound rose from the earth, a soft moan, almost human, almost childlike. Kalen's hand went to the hilt of his knife, though he knew it was useless against what stirred beneath. The widow knelt, whispering words of comfort to the air. "It's him," she said. "He is trying to speak. The shadow is strong, but he remembers love and sorrow. We must help him." Kalen felt a pull in his chest, a mixture of fear and longing. He had never been close to anyone, never felt the weight of another soul so strongly. Yet here he was, kneeling beside a woman who had lost everything, feeling responsible for a child who had never truly lived long enough to know the world. The widow placed her hand over Kalen's. "We must enter," she said. "The ritual site, the energy there is strong. If we confront it together, perhaps we can free him." Kalen nodded, his jaw tight. Fear coiled in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He had faced storms, avalanches, and the wilderness itself, but this was different. It demanded more than strength of body. It demanded courage of heart. They approached the altar, and the mist thickened around them, curling like fingers, brushing against their faces. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching and twisting along the broken stones. Kalen felt the pull of something deep beneath, an echo of grief and rage. The child's spirit was trapped, tethered to the sorrow that had filled his brief life. The widow whispered words in the old language, words Kalen could not understand but felt in his bones. The air shimmered, and the shadow rose from the ground, forming a shape faint and dark. It was neither fully human nor fully spirit, but its eyes, Kalen would never forget those eyes. Filled with sorrow, with longing, with accusation, they seemed to pierce his very soul. "Do not fear him," the widow said, her hand on Kalen's arm. "He is not your enemy. He is lost and scared. We must guide him, not fight him." Kalen swallowed hard. He had never faced a spirit, but he understood the truth in her words. Anger and fear would only feed the shadow. Compassion, understanding, perhaps those were the tools that could free it. The shadow drifted closer, its form flickering like smoke in the wind. Kalen stepped forward cautiously, speaking softly. "I will help you," he said. "You are not alone." The widow placed her hand over his, guiding his voice, her own whisper threading with his. Together they called to the child, calling him home, calling him peace. For a moment the shadow hesitated. The mist swirled around them, the forest silent, listening. Then the shape wavered, shrinking, softening, until the faintest outline of the child could be seen. His small face was pale but peaceful, eyes closing as if finally able to rest. Tears rolled down the widow's cheeks. He is free," she whispered. Kalen felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a tension that had pressed on him since the first time he saw her grief. But even as relief filled the air, he sensed the valley was not done speaking. The mist swirled, and from the ruins rose a low hum, a memory of the king's magic lingering, whispering, waiting. Kalen looked at the widow. "We cannot leave this place yet," he said. "Something remains, something that does not belong to the child alone." The widow nodded. "The curse is older than any of us. It binds not just him, but the land and all who walk upon it. We have begun, but the work is far from finished." Kaelin studied her, the firelight of the altar reflecting in her eyes. There was courage there, yes, but also fear. She had faced loss and darkness and yet still moved forward. Her strength stirred something within him, a feeling he had long thought lost hope. Together, they remained at the ruins until the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the broken stones. Kaelin could feel the valley breathing around them, alive with secrets, alive with stories yet to be told. And as night fell, the shadow of the mountain stretched long and dark, and Kaelin knew that the journey ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, sacrifice, and perhaps love. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried a whisper through the trees, a faint voice that seemed to say, "Watch closely, mountain man, the darkness remembers, and it waits for the next step." The ruins had gone silent, yet the valley around them seemed alive with anticipation. Kaelin and the widow, whose name he now knew was Selene, stayed near the altar until the last light of day had faded, and stars began to prick the night sky. The shadows of the mountain stretched long and dark, a reminder that the land itself remembered every sorrow and injustice. Kaelin stared at the altar, tracing the worn carvings with his fingers. Each line seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if the stone held its own heartbeat. "The shadow is gone for now," he said, voice low. "But the valley, it feels different. Something else waits." Selene nodded, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "The curse was never only on my child. It was tied to the family, to the land, and to those who dared disturb the king's dark work. We have taken the first step, but the heart of it, the source, still calls." Kaelin's chest tightened. He had faced storms, wolves, and treacherous cliffs, but this was a force he could not see or touch. Yet he felt it pressing against him, urging him forward. "What must we do?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. "We must go to the fortress," Selene said, pointing toward a jagged peak in the distance. "It is abandoned now, but long ago it was the heart of the king's dark magic. That is where the curse was woven. Only there can it be undone." Kaelin's eyes followed the line of her finger. The fortress looked dangerous even from afar. Its walls were broken, towers leaning like ancient teeth. Vines and moss crept across the stones, yet the dark presence that lingered made the air feel heavy and oppressive. "I have walked these mountains all my life," Kaelin said, his voice steady but low, "and I have avoided that place. The villagers call it cursed for a reason. Why risk it now?" Selene stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Because the child's soul is tied to it. Because my family suffered, and now because you promised." Kaelin looked into her eyes. He had thought himself immune to connection, but her words stirred something deep in him, a need he could not deny. He had promised, and a promise in this valley was heavier than any stone. "Then we go," he said. The next morning they set out at dawn. The path was treacherous, winding along cliffs and through forests thick with fog. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the mountains themselves were testing their resolve. Selene walked beside Kaelin, occasionally whispering words of old magic, guiding him through hidden paths that seemed to shift beneath their feet. The valley responded to her presence, the mist curling like fingers to shield them from eyes that might watch. As they climbed higher, the fortress came into view. Its walls were jagged, crumbling, yet there was a strange symmetry to the ruins. Kaelin felt a shiver run through him. The place seemed alive, aware of their approach. "This is where the king performed his rituals," Selene whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "He tried to claim life and soul, bending people to his will. The power lingers, waiting for someone to finish what he began." Kaelin clenched his fists. The stories Selene had told him now made sense in a way that chilled him. The child, the shadow, the whispering valley, All of it was tied to this fortress, and now they were entering the heart of it. The fortress gate was a massive arch of cracked stone. Kalen pushed it open, the sound echoing like a shout in the silent night. Inside, the air was cold, and the mist seemed thicker, moving with a life of its own. Shadows shifted across the walls, as if the stones themselves remembered the screams and prayers of long ago. They moved carefully, Selene leading, her fingers brushing along the walls. "The ritual room is deep inside," she said. "We must reach it before the shadow fully awakens." Kalen followed, every sense alert. The fortress was full of traps left by time and magic. Crumbling stairs, hidden pits, and stones that seemed to shift beneath their feet tested their every step. Yet they pressed on, driven by hope, duty, and something unspoken growing between them. Hours passed. The fortress seemed endless, a labyrinth of broken corridors and halls. Kalen felt the weight of history pressing down, stories of betrayal, greed, and sorrow etched into every stone. And always he felt the pull, the shadow that lingered, tied to the child, tied to Selene, tied to him. Finally, they reached a grand chamber at the heart of the fortress. The walls were carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness, and in the center stood a circular altar of black stone. It pulsed with a light that was neither warmth nor cold, a heartbeat that resonated deep within Kalen's chest. "This is it," Selene whispered. "The source of the curse. Everything begins here, and everything can end here." Kalen approached cautiously, feeling the weight of the magic in the room. The shadow stirred at the edges, a faint figure flickering in the mist. Its eyes were sorrowful and accusing, a reflection of every grief and injustice the valley had known. "It wants to bind me," Kalen said, his voice low, "to test my heart." Selene placed her hand on his shoulder. "Then show it your courage, show it your truth. Only love and understanding can undo what darkness created." Kalen nodded. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the altar. The shadow responded, swirling faster, darker, as if challenging him. He felt every memory of failure, every regret, every loss he had buried deep in his heart rise to meet him. And then he saw Selene standing beside him, her eyes fierce and unwavering. Her presence steadied him, anchored him to hope. The bond between them, fragile and new, gave him the courage to face the shadow. He spoke softly, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I do not fear you. I do not hate. I only wish to heal, to free, to give peace where it is deserved." The shadow paused. Its eyes, once full of sorrow and anger, softened slightly. The chamber grew quieter, the pulsing of the altar slowing as though listening. Selene stepped forward, joining her voice with Kalen's. "You are not alone," she said. "You do not have to hold this pain forever. The child deserves peace. The valley deserves peace. Let it go." The shadow hesitated, then began to shrink, folding in on itself, condensing until the faint outline of the child appeared. His face was pale but calm, eyes closing as though finally released from the weight of the world. Tears filled Selene's eyes. "He is free," she whispered. Kalen exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The valley seemed to breathe around them, the wind softening, the mist thinning, as if the land itself was relieved. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Kalen knew that the curse was not fully broken. The fortress still held power, the past still lingered, and the shadow's presence had left a mark on the land and on him. He turned to Selene. "We have done much, but the valley still remembers. There is more to be done." Selene nodded, placing her hand over his. "I know. But for now, we have given the child peace, and that is a beginning." They stayed in the chamber until the first light of dawn touched the mountains. Outside, the valley glimmered in soft gold, the mist retreating like a tide. Kalen and Selene walked together toward the fortress gate, their hands brushing, a quiet connection forming between them. It was fragile, yes, but real. The journey back was slower, careful, but the bond between them had shifted. There was trust now, respect, and a budding hope that even in a world full of sorrow and darkness, connection could endure. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Kalen paused. He could feel a presence behind them, subtle but unmistakable. The shadow or something tied to it lingered, not in anger but in watchfulness. Selene noticed his hesitation. "It is not gone completely," she said softly. "Some darkness remains, but it watches, not attacks. We have begun the healing." Kalen nodded, though unease lingered in his chest. "Then we must be ready," he said. "The valley has many secrets, and I have a feeling it will test us again." Selene smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and hope in her eyes. "Then we will face it together." As they walked down the mountain path, the wind carried a soft whisper through the trees, faint but unmistakable. "Watch closely, for the heart of darkness still remembers, and the next choice will be yours, mountain man." Kalen felt the weight of those words, heavy and real. But alongside it, he felt something new: resolve, courage, and the beginning of something like love. The valley stretched before them, beautiful, dangerous, and alive with secrets. And Kalen knew that the next step would demand more than bravery. It would demand trust, sacrifice, and the courage to face not only the darkness in the world, but the darkness within himself. The valley slept under a quiet night sky, stars glittering like frozen tears scattered across the heavens. But Kalen did not sleep. The weight of the fortress, the shadow, and the child's restless soul pressed on him still. Beside him, Selene sat by the fire in his cabin, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Kalen," she whispered, breaking the silence. "We have given the child peace, but the valley's heart still calls. Something remains at the fortress. The curse, it is not yet undone." Kalen nodded, feeling the pull in his chest once more. The mountains, the ruins, the very soil, they remembered. They remembered the grief, the pain, the cruelty of a long-dead king who had bound magic to lives in ways no ordinary human could understand. The valley demanded justice, and it demanded action. "I know," Kalen said, his voice low. "I can feel it, and we will go back. We will face whatever lingers there, together." Selene's hand brushed against his, and a quiet understanding passed between them. It was fragile, this bond that had grown from sorrow and courage, yet it was real. For the first time in years, Kalen felt he did not walk alone. Before dawn, they set out. The mountain path was steep and treacherous, shrouded in mist. Every step seemed heavier than the last, as though the valley itself tested their resolve. Kalen carried a satchel of herbs and charms Selene had prepared, and in his heart, a resolve that was stronger than fear. As the fortress loomed ahead, more formidable than before, Kalen noticed how the air had changed. It was thick, charged with old magic, the remnants of centuries of grief and cruelty. Shadows shifted unnaturally among the broken towers, curling and twisting as though alive. Selene took his hand, her grip steady. "We must be careful," she said. "The magic here reacts to fear, to anger, to doubt. We must move with courage and clarity." Kalen nodded, his eyes fixed on the fortress gate. "Then let us face it with open hearts. Whatever waits, we will not run." The gate creaked open under Kalen's push, revealing the interior hall, dim and cold. Stones cracked and leaned against one another, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls, carrying the faint echoes of past rituals. Every step they took seemed to stir the air, the shadows shifting and following their movements. They moved carefully toward the central chamber, where the altar had stood before. The circular stone glowed faintly in the darkness, a heartbeat that resonated deep within Kalen's chest. The shadow, now more substantial than ever, lingered at the edges. Its form flickered, a twisting silhouette of sorrow and accusation. Kalen took a deep breath. "We do not fear you," he said, stepping forward. "We seek only to heal, to release what has been bound for too long." Selene's voice joined his, soft and melodic, threading with his own. "You are not alone. You are not the child. You do not need to carry this pain. Let it go." The shadow wavered, twisting and spinning in the air, its form larger, darker, more powerful than before. Kalen felt the weight of centuries of grief pressing down, testing his courage. Every regret, every loss he had ever known surged within him, but he did not falter. Seleni's hand on his arm anchored him, her steady presence giving him strength. Slowly, they approached the altar. Kalen placed his hands on the cold stone, feeling the pulse of old magic. He called to the child again, to the shadow, to the valley itself. His words were simple yet full of conviction. "You are free. You do not need to carry this sorrow. You can rest." Selene knelt beside him, her own voice blending with his. "The child, the valley, and all who suffered, they deserve peace. We offer it to them. Let the past release what it holds." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the shadow began to waver, folding in upon itself, shrinking and softening. Its dark edges blurred, and a faint outline of the child appeared once more, small and pale but serene. The oppressive heaviness lifted, and the air grew lighter. Kalen exhaled, feeling the valley's tension ease. The ruins no longer pressed upon them with silent accusation. The magic that had haunted the fortress for centuries now pulsed faintly, gentle and peaceful, a heartbeat of memory and release. Selene whispered, her voice trembling with relief, "He is free. The curse, it is undone." Kalen felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a mixture of triumph, relief, and something more tender, something he had thought lost to the mountains and the weight of solitude. He looked at Selene and saw the same emotion reflected in her eyes. They stayed by the altar as dawn broke, golden light spilling across the stones, mist retreating from the valley. The mountains glowed softly, the first light of day casting long, calm shadows. Birds began to sing in the distance, a melody of renewal that filled the valley with hope. Kalen and Selene walked out of the fortress slowly, their steps careful on the broken stones. Outside, the valley seemed transformed. The mist lingered but now carried a softness, a sense of awakening. The trees swayed gently, and the wind whispered not in warning but in relief. As they descended the mountain path, their hands brushed, then held, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. It was unspoken, fragile, and powerful all at once. Kalen broke the silence. "The valley, it has changed, but so have we. This journey, it has not only freed the child, it has freed us too." Selene smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and hope in her expression. "We have faced darkness together, and we have chosen light, trust, and courage. That is no small thing." They paused at a cliff overlooking the valley below. The village, distant but visible, seemed peaceful under the morning sun. The mist drifted over the fields, carrying a sense of calm. Kalen felt the weight of the mountains behind them and the vastness of the world ahead. "Do you think it is truly over?" Selene asked softly. Kalen studied the valley, feeling the pulse of life, grief, and memory in every tree, rock, and stone. "The curse may linger in memory," he said, "but what matters is the choice we made. We have freed what could be freed, and sometimes that is enough." Selene nodded, resting her head briefly on his shoulder. In that moment, the hardships, the sorrow, and the dangers they had faced seemed to crystallize into something beautiful: trust, understanding, and a bond forged in darkness but shining with light. For hours they stood in silence, watching the valley awaken. The forest stirred, the mountains breathed, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and earth. The shadow of the past remained in memory but no longer held power over the living. Kalen realized that he had changed. The solitude that had once defined him now felt incomplete without Selene. And Selene, who had carried grief like a heavy cloak, seemed lighter, freed by the valley's blessing and by the courage of the mountain man at her side. As the sun climbed higher, Kalen turned to her. "Selene, this journey has shown me many things, about fear, about courage, and about love. Perhaps it is time we no longer walk alone." Selene met his gaze, her eyes soft but unwavering. "Then let us walk together," she said, her voice steady. "Through the mountains, the forests, and whatever life brings, together." Kalen felt a warmth spread through him, a lightness he had never known. The valley around them seemed to agree. the wind carrying their words through the trees, the mountains, and the fields. They descended toward the village, each step confident and measured. The journey had changed them, strengthened them, and bound them together in ways neither had anticipated. The ruins behind them were no longer a place of fear, but a reminder of courage and redemption. Yet Kalen could not shake a final whisper in the wind. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a memory of old magic lingering in the valley. Watch closely, for life always carries shadows even in the dawn. He looked at Selene and smiled. Then we will face them as we have faced everything else, together. The valley stretched below them, alive and vibrant, yet carrying the weight of centuries. But Kalen and Selene walked forward side by side, hearts aligned, ready to meet the future. The mountains watched, the trees whispered, and the air carried a sense of peace at last. In that moment, Kalen understood the truth of the valley, that even in darkness, courage and love could carve a path through shadow, and that redemption was possible, not only for the lost but for those who dared to care, to hope, and to act. And as the sun rose fully over the peaks, the valley, the ruins, and the souls within felt lighter, freed, and alive, just as Kalen and Selene had become. The story had reached its end, but life, as always, would continue, stronger, brighter, and filled with the promise of new beginnings.